The 1930s could easily be considered one of the darkest parts in American history. The stock market crash brought a rapid end to the elaborate and wealthy lifestyles that were lived in the 1920s. After the stock market crash, the 1930s began with over 15 million who were unemployed, and a president who didn't seem to have the solutions. With the economy in shambles and the Depression affecting all of the social classes, America needed a change. The American dream seemed to no longer exist. People came from all over the world to achieve the white picket fence, and after the Great Depression, the white picket fences were being taken away from many citizens, in the form of foreclosures and other economic consequences. Throughout the remainder of the 1930s, political leaders worked with citizens to make America great again. The 1930s are undeniably the most important decade in history because of the aftermath of the Great Depression, FDR's creation of the New Deal, Roosevelt's 100 Days, the Dust Bowl, the beginning of the Social Security, and the court packing plan. One of the most noted events of the 1930s was the Great Depression. According to the Australian economist Ludwig von Mises, the economic downturn had been brewing for years. He began predicting the stock market crash as early as 1924. Ludwig and other economists recognized that consumer spending and the production of goods was increasing at an unsustainable rate. A professor of business at Ohio State University, by the name of Dr. Charles Aminos Dice, made his own predictions about the stock market just 16 days before the crash. He said, "Are the truisms that what come up must come down, that stock prices cannot safely exceed 10 times the net earnings available for dividends on the common stock per share." Many investors argued that the Great Depression was not a possibility, and they chose to not heed the warnings from the economists because they were enjoying their seemingly ever-growing wealth. This was also a different age for investors, because not only were the big investors playing around with the stock market, but small investors, the average man, and businesses were investing too. Sadly, the day of these investors came to a screeching halt when Wall Street fell into a panic as millions of investors were wiped out and hundreds of thousands of citizens ran to the bank to withdraw their money, only to see that it was not there. So many people were affected by the Great Depression because almost every group of the nation was involved in the banks in some way. You had farmers who were attempting to increase the size of their farms to compensate for low prices. You also had a large amount of bank loans being handed out to families that were in need, meaning they were affected once the banks declared bankruptcy. The Great Depression had many effects, some immediate and some long-term. One of the most immediate was an increase in crime rates. Those who were unemployed were left with no income, therefore couldn't provide food and clothing for their families. They then turned to petty theft in order to give their families what they needed. There was a rise of alcoholism as many Americans seeped and escaped from the realities they were having to face. Healthcare was put on the back burner for many Americans because they couldn't afford that extra expense. Hoovervilles, also called shanty towns, started popping up around the cities, inhabited by American citizens who had not received any financial relief from the government. These occurred because many city dwellers and those in urban areas could no longer afford to pay their rent, so they fled towards less expensive housing, such as Hoovervilles. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to put an end to the country's turmoil and introduced the New Deal in 1933. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1933, and he immediately went to work on reconstructing the country from the Great Depression. 1932 was a grim year for America, seeing that over 1/4 of the workforce were without jobs. Roosevelt collaborated with Congress to create a system that would not only stimulate the economy, but also provide relief for those who were still suffering. Roosevelt addressed over 100,000 people during his first inaugural address on March 4, 1933. He knew that in a time so dark, he had to show people he was on their side and that America could prosper again. He said to the audience, "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." With the people's trust behind him, he introduced a program known as the New Deal, which aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. Just 2 days into office, Roosevelt issued a nationwide bank holiday, which prohibited withdrawals from the banks during the 4-day holiday. His next move was to ask Congress to end prohibition in order to boost sales and bring some of the alcohol factories back into production. He then focused on the Tennessee Valley River and those who needed an inexpensive hydroelectric source of power along the river. His passing of the Tennessee Valley Authority Act in May put many dams along the river to control floods and generate the power that was needed by many. In that same month, FDR convinced Congress to pass a bill that would pay dairy, wheat, tobacco, and corn farmers to leave their plots of land bare. The goal of this was to boost prices and bring an end to the economic surplus. In the following month of June, the National Industrial Recovery Act was put into place. This act granted workers the right to unionize and bargain with their employers for higher earning wages. Some argued that the government shouldn't have intervened in these areas. President Herbert Hoover preached resilience and self-reliance and said the economic downturn was a passing incident in our national lives. Despite those who believed that the government could have been overstepping their boundaries, almost every single American was happy with at least one thing that FDR was able to accomplish during his first 100 days in office. Although many economic issues had been addressed and the majority of the citizens were receiving the help that they needed, those on the U.S. prairies were in need of assistance too. FDR now had the Dust Bowl to conquer. World War I skyrocketed the prices of grains, and this drew many families to Great Plains. From 1935 to 1937, the Great Plains were suffering from one of the worst droughts they had ever seen. The 150,000 miles of farmland made up of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and others had reached a point of desperation where they not only needed rain, but they needed government relief. Local news stories were interviewing those who had lived in the heart of the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was made up of many dust storms. A dust storm was caused by the winds blowing up loose topsoil of the plains into a swirling pattern, which looked almost like a black blizzard to those who were living in the affected areas. One of the many families suffering said, "Some people thought the end of the world was at hand when every trace of daylight was obliterated at 4:00 p.m. The high winds, extreme lack of rainfall, and malnourished soil was not sufficient enough for farmers to be able to grow enough crops to make a profit. The lack of rain was not the only issue at hand. The high winds would choke the cattle to death and make working conditions almost impossible. In response to the influx of fleeing families from the Great Depression, FDR extended his New Deal plan to the families in need. He helped establish the Soil Conservation Service in 1935. This group worked to promote rehabilitation to the families suffering, as well as improve the conditions of their land. Government worked to instruct farmers on ways that they could personally improve their land. Some of these tactics including carving contour patterns into the soil in order to get it to hold rainwater, and allowing patches of soil to remain unseeded for a year in order to allow the soil to regenerate nutrients. Despite the government efforts, more than 2.5 million people had fled from the Great Plains by 1940. The families who were fleeing received the name Okies and likely fled to California, Oregon, and Washington. One of the reasons they fled west was because they had relatives located around the coastal areas. People fled to California because the state advertised the possible job opportunities in the agricultural fields. The Dust Bowl continued to work itself out, and now it was time for Roosevelt to focus back on welfare and the financial stability of those aged 65 and over. This led to the enactment of Social Security in 1935. On August 14, 1935, press reporters captured FDR standing with Congress for the passing of the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act was the only one of its kind, seeing that it ensured an income for those who were unemployed and for those who were aged 65 and over. The Social Security Act was yet another one of Roosevelt's great workings from his New Deal plan. The idea behind Social Security was to give Americans a slight incentive at the time to go to work, furthermore boosting the economy. If an American was worried about what their retirement may hold, they could work to ensure that they would have an income once they hit retirement. The day that Roosevelt put the Social Security Act into place, he said to his audience, "Young people who have come to wonder what will be their lot when they have come to old age, as well as those who had employment but no job security. We can never insure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life." With this statement, FDR is explaining that his goal for the program are to help prevent as many impoverished elders in the future as possible. Roosevelt had managed to answer many of the nation's economic problems, so he turned his attention to fixing the Supreme Court. In an attempt to neutralize the viewpoints of the court, Roosevelt proposed his court packing plan. Since FDR had been elected in 1932, he had many bills and acts that had to go through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not always rule in favor of him. In fact, it seemed as though they had made it their mission to strike down the New Deal in the first 100 days. After a series of rulings against FDR from the Supreme Court, specifically after the Supreme Court invalidated FDR's Agricultural Adjustment Act, and in an attempt to preserve the New Deal, Roosevelt proposed the court packing plan. Roosevelt's plan would allow him to appoint as many as 6 new Supreme Court judges to the judiciary, raising the number from 9 to 15. His goal was to bring new blood into the court, which would keep the decisions of the nation modern and constantly evolving. His system of reorganizing the federal courts would give him the power to appoint a new judge every time one of the active members was over 70 years old and had not yet retired. Some speculated that Roosevelt's court packing plan was an attempt to gain ultimate power in the Supreme Court. The Washington Post published a cartoon entitled Samson, where a big, strong man, who is supposed to represent Roosevelt, is breaking columns and other architecture that is supposed to represent the legislative balance, judiciary balance, and American democracy. However, Roosevelt justified his plan when he said to the people, "We must find a way to take an appeal from the Supreme Court to the Constitution itself. We want a Supreme Court which will do justice under the Constitution, not over it. In our court, we want a government of laws and not of men." Sadly, Roosevelt's plans soon crumbled when the Supreme Court ruled in his favor in March regarding the minimum wage for law in Washington state, and again in May with the Social Security Act. After the Supreme Court rulings, Roosevelt's plans were only weakened when the 4 Supreme Court judges retired and 2 passed away. Many, such as PBS, believed that it was foolish of Roosevelt to fight this battle because anyone could have seen that nature would have taken its course soon enough. According to the American experience, for the first time since his election, FDR had been publicly humiliated and utterly defeated in a battle he need not have fought. Roosevelt's first public failure brought an exciting end to the 1930s. By the end of the 1930s, America was well on their way to being a strong nation where the American dream was once again in sight for many. With the help of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and cooperation from Congress, it had seemed that we had succeeded in making America great again. The discontinuation of prohibition boosted the economy drastically, as did the fees that were paid to farmers to keep their land bare. Social Security ensured a future for many and helped reduce the chances of people 65 and over becoming impoverished. As it stands, Social Security had remained almost unchanged since it was put into place in 1935. The aftermath of the Great Depression, FDR's creation of the New Deal, Roosevelt's 100 days, the Dust Bowl, the beginning of Social Security, and the court packing plan shaped America for years to come. It is all because of these historic events that the 1930s are undeniably the most important era in the 20th century.
Happy feet, you better fall down, beat that baby, get down.